Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Tuscan onion soup. That's right, I love history and I love food, which is why I've always wanted to try making Carabaccia, since this is the ancient ancestor of what today we call French onion soup. And apparently it was brought to Paris by the de Medicis like 500 years ago. But anyway, I realize you're not here for a history lesson. I mean, most of you are not even here for a cooking lesson. But regardless, let's go ahead and get started with this extremely delicious and very comforting recipe. And to begin, we're going to have to slice up a whole bunch of onions. And not just any onions. One of the things that makes this soup so unique is we're going to use red onions. And to do this right, we are going to need a fair amount. All right, believe it or not, I have about 4 pounds here, as these onions were huge and went about a pound each. And what we'll do after cutting off the ends, halving it and taking off the skin, is cut this into about 1/4-inch slices. And as I might have explained to you before, there's 2 ways you can do this. Okay, you see those lines on the onion? Sometimes referred to as the grain. Okay, if we slice these across those fibers, in other words against the grain, would the onion turn this way? Our pieces of onion will basically fall apart if you cook it long enough. Whereas if we slice it with the grain, in this direction, those pieces will definitely still get soft, but they will hold their shape. Which is why that's how I'm going to cut it for this recipe. Besides, I've always thought if you cut it this way, there's less tears. Although, like so many of my culinary theories, I can't prove that. But anyway, no matter how you slice them, once our 4 pounds of onions have been prepped, we're going to transfer those into our largest skillet, along with a few tablespoons of olive oil, which we have set over medium-high heat. And we're also going to toss in a fairly large amount of kosher salt. And yes, if you want, you can do this step in a roasting pan in the oven, which is a nice and very passive way to accomplish this step. But for whatever reason, I decided to go with the stovetop. I guess I was in kind of a stirring mood. Speaking of which, because I have such a ridiculous amount of onions in the pan, I wasn't actually able to do too much stirring until these heated through and kind of slumped down in the pan. But once that happened, I was fine. And at that point, we'll reduce our heat to medium and cook these stirring occasionally for a long time, as in like about an hour, or until they get very soft and sweet. And if everything goes according to plan, and you cut them in the same direction I did, they're going to probably look a little something like this. And by the way, if you're tempted to turn up the heat to save a little time, don't. All right, for this recipe, we really do not want to brown the onions, which will definitely change the flavor profile. So leave it on medium or lower, and take your time. And then what we'll do once our onions are to this point is go ahead and add exactly 3 sage leaves, as well as some freshly ground black pepper, and then a very small pinch of cinnamon. All right, just a very small hint. And that is the ingredient here that makes this soup taste so unique, and also apparently makes it authentic, as does the next ingredient, a little bit of ground almond. And what we'll do is give this a stir, and let it cook for about 2 or 3 minutes, so that our onions and olive oil have a little bit of time to absorb those flavors. And for the record, those last 2 ingredients were totally optional, and they're often not even found in modern versions of this recipe, especially the cinnamon. Because while it is true that does make this unique and authentic, it is also true it could have many people not liking the flavor of this soup. And the reason is, when you add cinnamon to something, it will generally amplify the sweetness of the dish. And since slowly cooked onions are already very sweet to begin with, the addition of the cinnamon for some folks is just going to make this too sweet and not savory tasting enough. And by the way, I'm going to spend most of the blog post talking about that very issue. But anyway, like I said, we will cook that stirring for a couple minutes, at which point we can transfer that mixture into a saucepan or soup pot. And then, speaking of sweetness, to balance things out, we will add 3 tablespoons of red wine vinegar. And then last but not least, 5 or 6 cups of a good quality stock or broth, which classically would be a vegetable stock. But as you can probably see from the fat droplets floating on the top, that's not what I used. All right, vegetables don't have fat, which is one of my main problems with them. So I went with a beautiful homemade beef broth. And by the way, they say this was Leonardo da Vinci's favorite soup, since he was in fact a devout vegetarian. True story. But anyway, regardless of which you use, we will go ahead and stir that in, and then bring this up to a simmer on high heat. And then once it's bubbling, we will back our heat down to medium-low, and cook this for at least 30 minutes before serving. And about a half hour later, mine looked a little something like this. And that's it, other than tasting and adjusting for salt, which is of course mandatory. Our Carabaccia is done, and it is ready to serve just as soon as we make the toast to go in the bowl. Which I was going to say is optional, but it's not. definitely make this toast. And we will do that by drizzling some olive oil onto both sides of some sliced Italian bread. And then once that's been oiled, we'll go ahead and apply some thinly sliced sage leaves. And we don't want too much, but we definitely want enough. And then we will finish this up with some freshly grated cheese. Either some pecorino, preferably Tuscan, or some Parmesan, which is what I'm using. So you decide. I mean, you guys are after all the Leonardo da Vinci's of which cheese. But both will work beautifully. And that's it. Once cheese, we'll go ahead and pop that into the center of a 400-degree oven for about 15 minutes or until beautifully browned. And that's it. Once our toast is done, we can move on to final production. So we'll go ahead and fill up a bowl with our beautiful red onion soup. And by the way, the ancient Tuscans would have definitely put the toast at the bottom of the bowl and then ladle the soup over the top so as to fully saturate and soften the bread. But you know what? The ancient Tuscans did not have to take pictures. So I'm going to be putting my toast on top. And I'll finish this off with a little more olive oil and a lot more cheese. And I think as long as we promise to dunk this into the soup and let it soak for a few minutes before eating, everybody's going to be fine with this approach. Even ancient Tuscans. So that's what I did. I took a few pictures and then submerged the bread and let it soak for a minute or two before digging in. And that, my friends, was one very delicious but very unusual onion soup. Okay, very similar to French onion soup for obvious reasons. But what makes this so unique is the way that little touch of cinnamon really enhances the sweetness of the onions, which, as I mentioned earlier, may or may not be something you're into. And again, we're going to cover that in the blog post. And I think if I was just enjoying the soup, without that cheesy sage bread, it might have been too sweet. But when you pair that extra savoriness from the toast with the soup, it really does actually work quite well. But anyway, above and beyond paying attention to the amount of cinnamon, this really was an extraordinarily interesting and complex soup. And whether you do this or not, at least now you know the origins of French onion soup, in case it ever comes up in conversation, which it won't. But anyway, that's it, my take on Carabaccia. I assume I'm pronouncing that perfectly. But if not, please let me know. But no matter how you say it, I really do hope you give it a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.